Governance is very much needed for just about every single organization. But what does that actually mean? Well, it usually comes down to authentication, authorization, cost optimization, and pretty much any rule that falls under security, resource optimization, cost optimization. And it could even be individual policies. And I'll talk about that in a second. So the first thing that I want to do is if I go to a particular project here in env0 and I go to settings, notice how I have credentials, okay? So I have deployment credentials, which I specify based on environment. And I also have cost credentials. I'll talk about the costs here in a second, but based on cloud provider, you're going to have to set up some credentials here. So there's API authentication involved. Next, if I go to policies, notice how I can add in particular policies in terms of preventing the ability to destroy environments, number of environments per user per project, but more importantly, if I go to the overall organizational settings, I can set based on user, team, role, and integrations. So for example, in users, let's say I click invite new user, I'll set up an email address, and then I'm going to choose whether they're a user or an admin. So luckily, you don't have to really guess too much here. It's either somebody that controls everything or it's just a user of the environment. And then you can have specific RBAC permissions based on project. So even if they're just a user, and let's say you want to give them full access to test, you can give them admin to this particular project, but only an organizational user. So your organizational admin really shouldn't be handed out too frequently. Now I can also do the same thing with teams. So within teams, if I add a new team here, I can specify the team, and then I can specify what organizational role that team is going to have. Within roles itself, I can add a new role, and I can get pretty granular here. So I can add it based on deployment permissions, environment permissions, project permissions, organization permissions, and then remote backend. So let's say, for example, I say deploy all, and I specify run plans, run applies. They can abort a deployment, they can run tasks, create new environments, they can edit environment settings, view projects, and write state. Now if I click save here, notice how unfortunately I cannot save it because it's not available in the free tier, but that's how you can create it nonetheless. Okay, next we have some integrations here. So for example, from a policy enforcement perspective, you may want to implement OPA, and that'll give you the ability to get pretty granular with the policies that are happening within your Kubernetes environments, for example. So just as an example here, you can set up a policy that says you cannot deploy the latest container image to production. You can only deploy a versioned container image, right? So maybe version 1.0 or 2.0, because the latest typically holds the beta or the alpha build. So you may want to put a governance policy in place for that. Okay, now from a cost perspective, if I come to a particular project and I click on that project, and I go to cost. If you have a particular cost, it will show up here. You should also be able to see the cost estimation under the deployment itself. So notice here how it's going to tell you a little bit about the cost configuration here. And how am I able to do that? Well, if I go to settings and I go to credentials like we were showing before, under cost credentials. So that's a little bit of the configuration on what you can do to set up governance around your users, teams, roles, who can deploy. You can even do it based on project right in here. So for example, in test, if I go to users, and if I had any other users here within my organization, I could add them in to manage this particular project.